Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight's story is a soft reimagining of Thumbelina, a story about smallness and the quiet journey of being carried through places that never quite feel like home. There's nothing you need to follow closely, no need to hold on to every detail. This is a story to rest inside, so settle in and let the world grow gentle around you. Let's begin. There was once a woman who lived alone in a small, well-kept house at the edge of a quiet village. Her days passed in gentle sameness. In the mornings, she opened the shutters to let in the light. In the afternoons, she worked with her hands, mending, tending, arranging small things so they might last a little longer. And in the evenings, she sat near the window where the last of the daylight lingered, watching it fade slowly from the garden. Nothing in her life was harsh or difficult. There was food enough, warmth enough, and a steady rhythm that asked very little of her. And yet, there was something missing. It didn't trouble her loudly. It didn't interrupt her work or steal her rest. But it was there, in the quiet spaces between moments, a sense that something small and dear had not yet come into her life. She didn't speak of it. There was no one to tell. Instead, she carried the feeling gently, as one might carry a folded letter, kept close, but seldom opened. One afternoon, when the air held the soft warmth of early summer, she walked a little farther than usual along the narrow road that curved beyond the village. There, not far from the hedgerow, stood a low, weathered cottage she had not noticed before. In the window sat an old woman. She was not unkind in appearance, though there was something knowing in the way she watched the road. When the woman approached, the old one opened the door without waiting to be asked. "You have come with a wish," she said, as though continuing a conversation already begun. The woman paused, not startled, but thoughtful. "Oh, I suppose I have," she answered, after a moment. The old woman stepped aside and gestured her in. The room beyond was dim, filled with the scent of dried herbs, and something faintly sweet. Shelves lined the walls, holding small bundles and jars, each carefully arranged. Without asking further, the old woman reached for a small pouch and drew from it a single grain, dark and smooth, no larger than a seed. "Plant this," she said, placing it into the woman's hand. "Tend it as you would any growing thing." The woman looked down at the tiny grain, turning it lightly between her fingers. "And then?" she asked. The old woman's expression did not change, but her voice softened slightly. "Then you must wait." There was nothing more to be said. The woman thanked her and made her way home, the small seed resting safely in her palm. That evening, she prepared a pot of soil and pressed the grain gently into its center. She watered it lightly, as she had done with many other plants before, and placed it near the window where it might receive the morning sun. Days passed. At first, nothing changed. The soil remained still, undisturbed. But the woman didn't hurry it. Each morning she watered it, and each evening she checked its place by the window, adjusting it so the light would fall just right. On the third day, a small green shoot appeared, delicate and pale against the dark soil. The woman leaned closer, her breath slowing as she watched it. It was not the kind of growth she was used to. There was something finer in its shape, something more deliberate, as though it unfolded with quiet intention rather than simple necessity. By the end of the week, the plant had grown taller. its leaves smooth and gently curved. At its top, there formed a single bud, closed tightly, its petals not yet revealed. She moved it carefully to the center of the table. That night, as the house settled into stillness, the bud began to open. It didn't happen all at once. The petals parted slowly, as though waking, each one easing away from the next until the flower stood fully revealed. It was unlike any she had seen before. Its color was soft, almost luminous, and the shape held a quiet symmetry that drew the eye without demanding it. And at its center, there lay a tiny girl. She was no bigger than a thumb. She rested within the petals as though they'd been made for her. Her small hands folded lightly, her breathing slow and even, as if she had been sleeping there all along. The woman didn't speak. She drew closer, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of the flower. For a moment, she simply watched, taking in the smallness of the figure, the stillness of her form. Then, as though sensing the presence near her, the little girl stirred. Her eyes opened, clear, untroubled, and she looked up. There was no fear in her gaze, no confusion, only quiet awareness, as if the world, however large, had never been something to question. The woman felt something settle within her then, a calm certainty that required no explanation. "Well," she said softly, though the word carried more warmth than sound. "You have come at last." The little girl shifted slightly, her small fingers brushing against the curve of the petal against her. The movement was unhurried, gentle, as there was no need to rush into anything beyond this moment. The woman reached for a walnut shell from the shelf nearby, lining it with soft cloth and a few of the flower's fallen petals. She worked slowly, with care, shaping a small bed that would hold the tiny girl comfortably. When it was ready, she lifted her carefully and placed her within it. The little girl didn't resist. She settled easily into the new space, her expression unchanged, as though each place she was given became for a time her own. From that night forward, the house was no longer quite the same. It remained quiet, and its rhythm didn't change, but within it, there was now something small and living, something that brought a gentle sense of presence to each passing hour. And for a while, that was enough. Morning came quietly, as it always had. The light slipped in through the window in a pale, steady line, settling first along the table, then gently across the small walnut shell where the tiny girl lay resting. The house held its usual stillness, but something within now seemed to listen. The woman rose and moved about her morning tasks with care, though there was no urgency in her steps. From time to time, she glanced toward the table, not out of worry, but with a quiet awareness, as though she had become attuned to a presence that required no sound to be known. When she approached at last, she found the little girl awake. She sat within the walnut shell, her small hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze moving slowly over the room. There was no sign of confusion in her expression. Instead, she looked with a kind of gentle curiosity, as though each object, the table, the window, the soft folds of cloth beneath her, was something to be considered, not questioned. The woman drew a chair closer and sat. "You must have a name," she said, her voice low so that it would not startle. "Something that suits you." The little girl turned her head at the sound, her eyes settling over the woman's face. "Thumbelina," the woman continued after a moment, a faint smile forming. "That will do, I think." The name seemed to rest easily in the room, as though it had been waiting for a place to belong. Thumbelina shifted slightly, her small feet touching the edge of the shell. She stood, steady despite her size, and looked once more about her surroundings. The morning light had warmed, and the faint scent of earth and petals still lingered from the flower that had opened that night before. The woman placed a small dish nearby, no larger than a coin, with a drop of milk resting within it. She added a few soft crumbs of bread, breaking them carefully so they would not seem too large. "You may eat," she said, though she didn't expect an answer. Thumbelina stepped forward, her movements measured but unafraid. She touched the edge of the dish, then lowered herself beside it, tasting the milk with a quiet, deliberate motion. There was something complete in the way she did this, as though each action belonged to its moment without needing to lead to anything more. The woman watched for a time, then returned to her work. The hours passed without interruption. The small house remained as it always had been, sunlight shifting slowly across the floor, the faint creak of wood as it settled, the distant sound of wind moving through the garden beyond the walls. And within that steady rhythm, Thumbelina became part of the day. The woman fashioned small things for her as the afternoon wore on. A blanket from soft thread, light enough to rest without weight. A length of ribbon, which she had placed near the shell as a kind of cover. Each piece was made with care, though none of it felt hurried or uncertain. And from time to time, Thumbelina moved about the table, exploring its edges with quiet steps. She paused often, looking outward toward the window where the garden stretched in muted greens and pale light. When the woman noticed this, she rose and carried the walnut shell closer to the window's edge. "There," she said softly. "You may see a little more from here." Outside, the garden held its usual calm. Leaves stirred only slightly, and the stems of the flowers bent in the faintest breeze. Nothing moved quickly. Nothing asked to be followed. Thumbelina stood near the edge of the shell and looked out. The world beyond was wide in a way she couldn't measure, but she didn't seem troubled by it. She watched the slow movement of the leaves, the shifting light, the quiet patterns that passed without urgency. The afternoon settled into evening, and as the light softened, the woman lit a small candle and placed it on the table. Its glow was gentle, casting a warm circle that held both the shell and the space around it in a quiet, steady brightness. Thumbelina lay down once more among the soft cloth and petals. Her breathing slowed, her small form stilling as sleep came, without resistance. The woman remained nearby, her hands resting in her lap as she watched the candle's flame. There was no need to speak, no need to move. The house, though unchanged in its form, had taken on a different kind of presence. Not fuller, not louder, but more complete in some quiet, difficult-to-name way. Outside, the evening deepened. The garden dimmed, its colors softening into shadow, while the window reflected back the small, warm interior of the room. Within that reflection, the walnut shell rested, the tiny figure within it barely visible beneath the folds of the cloth. The candle burned low, and at last the woman rose and moved it slightly closer, so its warmth might linger near the shell as the night settled in. She didn't linger long after that. The house returned to stillness, each object resting where it had been placed, and each space holding its quiet shape. And for a time, nothing disturbed it. But beyond the window, where the garden met the darker edge of night, something stirred. Not with sound, and not with urgency. It's a faint shift, barely enough to be noticed. And slowly, as the hours passed, it moved closer. The night held its quiet shape, but it was no longer untouched. Beyond the window, where the garden stretched into shadow, something had found its way closer, drawn not by sound, nor by light, but by a presence small enough to go unnoticed by most. The latch at the lower edge of the window hadn't been fastened. It shifted, just slightly, then stilled again. For a long while nothing followed. The house remained as it had been, wrapped in its gentle stillness. The candle had burned low, leaving only the faintest thread of warmth behind. On the table, the walnut shell rested near the window's edge, its soft lining rising and falling with Thumbelina's quiet breath. Then, without hurry, the window eased open. The air that entered was cool and damp, with the scent of water and earth. It moved slowly across the table, touching each object in turn before settling near the shell. The shape followed. It was low and broad, its movement steady, its presence neither hurried nor uncertain. The toad that had come from the marsh beyond the garden, where the reeds grew thick and the water lay still beneath them. It had moved through the dark without interruption, guided by a simple, quiet purpose. It paused at the edge of the table, its eyes wide and unblinking, fixed upon the small figure resting within the shell. There was no malice in its gaze, no urgency, only a dull certainty, as though what it saw had already been decided. Slowly, it drew itself closer. The table didn't creak, the cloth didn't shift. The small dish of milk remained undisturbed by the shell. Nothing in the room gave sign that anything had changed. The toad reached the walnut shell and remained there for a moment, as though considering. Then, with a careful motion, it lifted the shell. Thumbelina stirred slightly at the change in movement, her small hand brushing against the folded cloth beside her. But she didn't wake. The rhythm of her breathing remained soft and even, untouched by the quiet shift that carried her from the table. The toad turned, moving as steadily as it had come. It crossed the table's surface, descended the side without sound, and made its way toward the open window. The night beyond waited, still and wide, offering no resistance. In a moment, the shell had passed through the opening. The window eased closed behind it, and the house once again returned to stillness. Morning came as it always had. The light entered slowly, touching the familiar places in the room. It reached the table, warming the surface where the walnut shell had rested the night before. But the shell was no longer there. The woman rose, unaware at first that anything had changed. She moved through the morning as she always did, opening the shutters, setting her hands to their usual task. It was only when she approached the table that she paused. Her gaze settled upon the empty space. The small dish remained. The crumbs lay where they had been placed. The cloth, folded neatly, had not been disturbed. But the shell was gone. She stood for a long moment without moving. Then she reached out, touching the table, as though the surface might hold some answer. Her hand lingered there, resting against the wood that had held something small and living only hours before. There was no sign of struggle, no mark left behind, only absence. She didn't search the room. She didn't call out. Instead, she drew back slowly and lowered herself into the chair beside the table. And the house remained quiet. Outside, the garden moved as it always had, leaves stirring faintly, light shifting across the ground, the distant sound of wind passing through the trees. Nothing in the world beyond seemed to have noticed the change, and yet something within the house had altered in a way that couldn't be undone. The woman sat for a time, her hands folded loosely in her lap. At last she rose. She moved through the room once more, not searching, but simply continuing the motions of her day. The shutters remained open. The table was cleared. The small dish was taken away. The space where the shell had rested was left empty. By midday, the house had returned to its quiet rhythm. But it was not the same. Far from the village, where the land softened into marsh and reed, the morning light lay pale across the water. And there, among the long stems that rose from the shallows, the toad had settled upon a broad leaf near the edge of the pond. The walnut shell rested beside it. Thumbelina stirred as the warmth of the morning reached her. Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment, she remained still, her gaze unfocused as though the world had not fully returned. Then, as awareness came, she lifted herself slightly, her small hands pressing against the soft lining beneath her. The air was different, cooler, damp. The scent of water surrounded her, along with the faint rustle of reeds moving in the breeze. She sat upright and looked around. The house was gone, and in its place stretched a wide open space of water and green, leaves floating upon the surface, stems riding in quiet clusters, the sky reflected faintly in the stillness below. The shell rested upon a leaf that drifted just enough to remind her that nothing here was fixed. The toad sat nearby. It watched her without expression, its body unmoving, its eyes steady. After a time, it spoke. "You will do," it said, its voice low and thick, as though unused by being heard. Thumbelina didn't answer. She turned her gaze outward instead, looking across the water where the reeds parted and closed again with the slow movement of the air. The toad shifted slightly, as though settling more comfortably beside the shell. "My son will be pleased," it continued. "You will sit with him. You will live here." The words carried no force. They were spoken as simple facts, already decided. Thumbelina's hands rested in her lap. She did not move. The leaf beneath her drifted a little farther from the edge. The water, though calm, stretched in every direction, offering no clear path back to what had been. And for the first time, something within her quiet stillness began to shift. Not with fear, but with the faintest awareness that she was no longer where she belonged. The morning settled over the marsh in a pale, even light, touching the surface of the water without breaking it. The reeds stood tall and quiet, their thin leaves stirring only when the breeze moved through them with the faintest intention. Everything seemed to exist without hurry, as though time itself had softened in this place. Thumbelina remained where she had been set, the walnut shell resting upon the broad green leaf. The water beneath her had shifted in slow, almost unnoticeable movements, enough to remind her that nothing here was held firmly in place. The air carried a coolness that lingered along the surface of her skin, different from the still warmth of the house that she had known. She didn't speak. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, and her gaze moved gently from one thing to another, the long stems rising from the water, the reflections that wavered beneath them, the distant edges of the marsh where the light grew softer and less certain. Nearby, the toad remained. It had not moved far. Its body rested low against the leaf, its eyes half-lidded now, as though the effort of the night had passed and left it content to wait. From time to time, it shifted slightly, adjusting its weight without leaving its place. And after a while it rose. Without looking at Thumbelina, it spoke again, its voice carrying the same steady tone as before. "You will stay here," it said. "It's quiet. It's good." There was no question in the words. The toad moved away then, slipping from the leaf into the water below with a soft, hardly audible sound. The surface closed behind it, returning at once to its calm, unbroken state. Thumbelina watched where it had gone. For a moment, nothing followed. Then, not far from the leaf, the water stirred again. Another shape emerged, smaller, though not by much, and less certain in its movement. It climbed slowly onto a nearby stem, its limbs moving with a kind of awkward care. This was the sun. He didn't come too close at first. Instead, he remained where he had settled, watching Thumbelina in the same quiet, unblinking way. And after some time, he spoke. "Croak," he said, though the sound held little meaning beyond itself. Thumbelina inclined her head slightly, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. The sun seemed satisfied with this. He shifted his position once, then became still again, as though this exchange had been enough. The hours passed in this manner. The sun rose higher, warming the surface of the water and the leaves that floated upon it, and the air grew softer, the cool edge fading into something more tempered. Small insects moved here and there, touching the water lightly before lifting again. Thumbelina remained upon the leaf. She didn't attempt to move the shell. She didn't call out, but her gaze lingered longer now in the spaces between the reeds, on the narrow channels where the water opened slightly before closing again. There was distance there, and within that distance, a quiet possibility. The leaf drifted a little farther from where it had been first placed. It didn't move quickly. The change was so gradual that it might not have been noticed at all had one not been watching for it. But Thumbelina felt it, the subtle shift, the way the water guided rather than held. She stood. Her small feet found the edge of the shell, and from there, the surface of the leaf. It was firm enough to support her, though it bent slightly beneath her weight, adjusting without breaking. She steadied herself and looked outward again. The marsh stretched wide, but not without pattern, and there were openings between the reeds, narrow passages where the water flowed more freely. Some led nowhere, closing in upon themselves. Others curved out of sight. The air moved gently. The leaf responded. It turned almost imperceptibly, aligning itself with one of the slow-moving channels. Thumbelina remained where she stood, her hands at her side, her gaze following the direction of the drift. Nothing urged her forward. Nothing held her back. The movement came from elsewhere, from the water, from the air, from the quiet balance between them. And time passed. The sun reached its highest point, then began its slow descent. The light softened again as the brightness easing into warmer tone. Shadows lengthened along the reeds, stretching across the surface of the water. The leaf had carried her farther now. The place where she had first been set was no longer clearly visible. The stems had closed behind her, her reflection blending with the sky above. From time to time, a ripple moved through the water, touching the edge of the leaf before fading again. And Thumbelina sat once more, drawing her feet beneath her. Her hands rested lightly against the surface beside her, feeling the faint vibration of the water below. There was no sudden change, no movement where the marsh ended or something began new, only a gradual shifting, a slow, steady movement away from what had been placed upon her and towards something not yet known. And as the evening approached, the air cooled once more. The light thinned, spreading across the water in soft, fading lines. The insects grew fewer. The reeds stilled. The leaf continued its quiet passage, and though Thumbelina did not yet know where it would carry her, she didn't turn back. The marsh receded behind her, not in distance alone, but in presence. And though what had held her there had loosened without needing to be undone, the water ahead lay open, and the drift went on. The water carried her farther than she could have guessed. By morning, the marsh had thinned. The tall reeds no longer stood so closely together, and the narrow passages between them had widened into gentle, open stretches where the sky reflected more clearly on the surface below. The air felt light here, touched less by the still dampness of the deeper marsh, and more by the quiet warmth of the open ground. Thumbelina woke as the light reached her. The leaf had come to rest among a cluster of broad, low plants whose stems rose just above the waterline before spreading outward. Their leaves were wide and smooth, catching the sunlight in a soft, steady glow. She sat up slowly, her hands brushing the edge of the walnut shell. And for a moment, she didn't move beyond that. The drift of the night had carried her into a place that didn't feel enclosed. The air moved more freely. The space around her seemed to breathe in a way the marsh hadn't. She stood. The leaf beneath her shifted slightly as she stepped onto it. But it held, and the water below remained calm, its surface marked only by the faintest ripple where something small passed beneath. She looked outward. The reeds lay behind her now, their tall shapes softened by distance. Ahead, the water opened further, edged by low banks where grasses and small flowering plants had taken root. There was no sign of the toad, no sound of its voice, no movement in the water to suggest that he had followed. The quiet here felt different. Not the held stillness of the marsh, but something more, less certain, perhaps, but not confined. She remained standing for some time, her gaze moving slowly across the surface of the water and the shapes beyond it. Then, from above, there came a sound. It was light, brief, and easily lost within the air. A flicker, more than a call. Before she could truly turn to it, something descended. It came swiftly but without violence, its movement controlled, its landing precise. A large beetle settled upon the edge of the leaf, its wings folding neatly across its back as it came to rest. Its body gleamed faintly in the morning light, dark with hints of green that shifted as it moved. Its legs gripped the surface of the leaf with quiet certainty, as though it had chosen its place without question. And for a moment, it didn't notice her. It just adjusted its position, turning slightly, its head lowering as though to inspect the leaf itself. Then, as its gaze shifted, it stopped, its attention fixed on Thumbelina. There was a pause, not long but distinct. The beetle tilted its head slightly as though attempting to understand what it was seeing. Then, without hesitation, it moved closer. "You are not from here," it said. Its voice was lighter than the toad's, quicker in its rhythm, though not unkind. Thumbelina did not step back. She stood where she was, her hands at her side, her gaze meeting the beetle's without resistance. The beetle circled her once, its movement smooth and deliberate. It seemed to examine her from each angle, pausing now and then as though committing each detail to its understanding. "You are very small," it continued, "and not shaped as we are." There was no judgment in the words, only observation. But before Thumbelina could respond, the beetle moved again, coming to rest just beside her. "You will come with me," it said, and with that, it reached forward. Its legs, though slender, were strong. They lifted her easily as though her weight was no more than a leaf that she had stood upon. The motion was sudden, but not rough. The ground fell away. The leaf, the water, the quiet expanse she had begun to understand, all of it dropped gently out of reach as the beetle rose into the air. The movement was smooth. The air passed around her, cool and steady. Below, the water stretched in shifting patterns, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of the dark line of a submerged stem. Thumbelina didn't struggle. Her hands rested lightly against the beetle's form, steadying herself as the world moved beneath her. They didn't travel far. The beetle descended again only after a short while, settling upon the branch of a low tree that leaned out over the water. Its leaves were broader here, layered in soft green, offering shade that held the warmth without letting it grow too strong. The branch was alive with movement. Other beetles moved among the leaves. Their forms varied, but similar enough to be recognized as one kind. Some paused as the newcomer arrived, their attention shifting at once toward what it carried. The beetle set Thumbelina down upon the leaf. At once, the others drew nearer. They didn't crowd her, but they formed a loose circle, their movements small and measured as they observed her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of them tilted its head and said, "She has 2 legs." Another shifted slightly, "And no feelers." A third added, "Her waist is narrow. It doesn't hold." The observations came without malice, but they gathered with a certain weight, each one adding to the quiet conclusion forming among them. Thumbelina remained still. Her hands rested lightly against the leaf, her posture unchanged. She didn't answer their remarks. The beetle who had brought her stood nearby, watching the others as they spoke. At first, it seemed unconcerned. But as the circle tightened, not in distance, but in certainty, its stance shifted. It looked at Thumbelina again, as though seeing her anew through the words of the others. There was a pause. Then, with a small movement that carried no force but held a quiet decision, it spoke. "She is different," it said. The others didn't disagree. The moment stretched. Then, just as simply as she had been taken, the beetle moved again. It lifted her once more. There was no explanation given, no apology offered. The others had already turned their attention elsewhere, their interest fading as quickly as it had formed. The air opened around them again. This time, the flight was shorter. The beetle descended toward a patch of grass not far from the water's edge, where the ground rose slightly above the damp soil. It set her down gently among the stems, where the earth felt firm beneath her feet. For a moment, it remained. Its wings shifted slightly, catching the light. "You will be better here," it said. Then it lifted again and was gone. The sound of its wings faded quickly, leaving only the quiet movement of the grass and the distant water beyond. Thumbelina stood where she had been placed. The ground beneath her was steady. The air moved softly through the stems around her, carrying the faint scent of green growth and sun-warmed earth. She didn't move at once. The space around her felt wider than it had before. And though nothing held her here, there was nothing that guided her onward. For the first time since the night that she had been taken, she stood upon ground that didn't drift, and the stillness that followed was her own. The ground held differently than the water had. It didn't shift beneath her. It didn't carry her without asking. It remained where it was, firm and quiet, offering no movement unless she chose it. Thumbelina stood among the tall blades of grass, their green stems rising around her like slender pillars. The light filtered through them in soft layers, breaking into gentle patterns that moved only when the air passed through. For a time, she didn't step forward. The stillness here was not the same as the marsh, nor the drifting calm of the water. It was something steadier, something that seemed to wait rather than guide. She lowered herself slowly to sit. The earth beneath her was warm from the morning sun, its surface uneven but not uncomfortable. Small grains pressed lightly beneath her hands as she steadied herself, adjusting to the texture of something that didn't bend or float. Around her, the world continued. Insects moved through the grass in quiet paths, the present marked only by the faintest disturbance in the stems. A breeze passed now and then, bending the taller blades before letting them return again to their upright stillness. Nothing approached her. Nothing called her name. The beetle had gone, and with it, the brief attention of that world. Here, there was only space, and after a while, she rose again. This time, she took a step. It was small, measured, her foot pressing into the earth with care. The ground didn't give away, and she took another, moving slowly between the stems, her hands brushing lightly against them as she passed. The space was open as she went. What had seemed dense from where she stood revealed narrow paths, small clearings where the grass grew less closely, where the light touched the ground more fully. The air felt warmer here, carrying the faint scent of dry leaves and sun. She moved without hurry. There was no clear direction, only the quiet sense that she might continue. By midday, she had come upon a patch of flowers. They were small, no larger than those that she had once known from the window's edge, but here they grew in clusters, their petals open to the light, soft colors resting among the green, pale yellows, gentle whites, and the faintest hints of blue. She paused beside them. The petals stirred as the breeze passed, their movement slow and unforced. One leaned just enough toward her that its center came within reach. She touched it. The surface was smooth, warm where the sunlight had rested upon it, and it didn't draw away from her hand, nor did it respond in any way beyond its quiet presence. She remained there for some time, her hand resting lightly against the petal. Then she moved on. The day passed in this way. Step by step, she made her way through the grass and the flowers, never far, but always a little beyond where she had been before. The sun rose higher. Then began its gradual descent, its light shifting from pale brightness to something softer and more golden. Hunger came, though not sharply. She found what she needed among the flowers and the small drops of moisture that rested in their leaves. Each action was simple, unhurried, as though the day itself allowed for nothing more. By the time the light began to lower, she had reached a place where the grass thinned and the earth rose slightly. Here, the ground was drier. A small opening lay ahead, no more than a gentle hollow beneath a cluster of roots that had pressed up through the soil. It offered a kind of shelter, though it had not been made for her. She paused at the edge. The air within was still, holding the faint warmth of the day. The space was narrow, but not closed, and the earth around it formed a quiet boundary that seemed to hold the light just a little longer, before letting it fade. She stepped inside. The ground was soft enough to rest upon, the roots aching overhead in a way that felt protective without enclosing her entirely. She sat, then lowered herself slowly, her hands folded beneath, as she settled into the space. Outside, the light continued to dim. The colors of the grass and flowers softened, their edges blending into the deeper tones of the evening. The breeze slowed, then stilled. Thumbelina lay quietly, her gaze turned upward to the opening. She could still see a small portion of the sky. It held the last of the light, fading gradually into a pale, distant glow. For the first time since she had been taken from the house, the day had passed without interruption. No one carried her, no voice had told her where she would go, no movement had taken her beyond her own choosing. The stillness that settled around her now was not empty. It was something she had come into on her own. Her breathing slowed. The warmth of the earth beneath her held steady, neither shifting nor fading too quickly. The space around her remained quiet, untouched by anything beyond the natural settling of the night. Then, from just beyond the entrance, there came a sound. It wasn't sudden, only a soft disturbance among the stems. measured, deliberate, as though something had been moving there for some time and had now only come close enough to be noticed. Thumbelina didn't rise at once. She turned her head slightly, her gaze settling on the narrow opening where the last of the light remained. For a moment, nothing more followed. Then a shape appeared, small, rounded, and close to the ground. It paused just outside the shelter, its whiskers faintly visible in the dimming light, its eyes dark and steady, regarded her with calm that held neither surprise nor alarm. "You'll not do well out here once the night turns colder," it said. The voice was low, practical, and without urgency. Thumbelina sat up slowly. The small creature stepped a little closer, though it didn't enter her space. "There's a place below," it continued. "Warmer than this. Dry. You may stay if you've sense enough to come." It didn't move further. It didn't insist. It simply waited. The light faded a little more. The air cooled. Thumbelina remained where she was, her hands resting lightly against the earth beside her. Then after a moment, she rose, and without haste, she stepped toward the opening. The entrance to the hollow narrowed as she stepped through it. The last of the evening light remained behind her, soft and fading, while ahead the earth closed gently around the path. It didn't feel like a place made in haste. The walls were smooth where they had been worn by passage, the ground firm beneath her feet, shaped by use rather than force. The small creature moved ahead, its body low and steady, its pace unhurried. "You'll mind your footing," it said, not turning back. "It dips in places." Thumbelina followed. The air shifted as they went. The warmth of the day lingered here, held within the earth, neither fading nor deepening. It was a steady kind of warmth, one that didn't depend on the sun. The passage curved. Roots passed overhead, crossing one another in quiet patterns, their shapes forming a kind of natural arch. Now and then, a thin thread of light found its way through, but it didn't reach far. They did not go deep. Only after a short distance, the space opened. It was not large, but it was complete. A small room shaped within the earth itself, with walls that curved gently inward and a ceiling held firm by the crossing roots above. The ground was covered with dry grasses, gathered and arranged into a soft layer that held its place without shifting. There was no clutter, only what was needed. The mouse, she saw now more clearly that it was a field mouse, moved from one side and began to arrange a small bundle of grain, nudging it into place with quick, practiced motions. "You'll sit there," it said, gesturing with a slight turn of its head toward a space near the wall. Thumbelina stepped forward. The ground felt warmer here, the air stiller. It carried the faint scent of dried leaves and stored food, a quiet, steady smell that spoke of preparation and time. She lowered herself to sit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The mouse continued its work, moving from one small task to another, adjusting, sorting, checking each thing as though it had been a long part of a pattern that did not require interruption. At last, it paused. "You came to the open ground," it said, its voice as even as before. Thumbelina inclined her head slightly. "I did." The mouse regarded her for a moment, its whiskers shifting faintly as it considered. "You'll find it less agreeable when the weather turns," it said. "The night grows colder sooner than one expects." It turned then, taking a small kernel of grain and placing it near where she sat. "You may eat," it added. Thumbelina reached for it. The grain was larger than anything she had held before, but broke it easily beneath her hands. She ate slowly, without hurry, the simple act settling into her quiet rhythm of the space. The mouse watched, but not closely. Its attention moved between her and the small stores it had gathered, as though both required a certain measure of awareness. though neither demanded it fully. "You may remain," it said after a time, "if you are of use." The words weren't unkind. They were spoken plainly, as though they carried no weight beyond their meaning. Thumbelina didn't answer at once. She rested her hands lightly against the ground, feeling the steadiness beneath her. The weight held without shifting or guiding. Then she said, "I will do what I can." The mouse gave a small nod, as though it had been expected. "You will keep things in order," it said. "There's little room for disorder here." It moved again, settling into the place among the gathered grains. The space grew quiet. Outside, the last of the light withdrew, completely. The days beneath the earth settled into a quiet pattern. There was no sunrise to mark their beginning, no evening light to signal their close. Instead, time passed in the steady rhythm of small tasks, gathering, sorting, arranging, each one fitting into the next without interruption. Thumbelina learned the order of things. In the mornings, she followed the field mouse along the narrow passages that led toward the surface, where the light still reached through in softened strands. There, she gathered what had fallen, seeds loosened from their stems, petals released without resistance, small fragments of the world above that could be carried below and kept. She moved carefully, her hands light, taking only what could be lifted without effort. Nothing that resisted. The mouse approved of this. "You'll do well enough," it said once, not pausing in its work. "There's sense in not taking more than what is given." Thumbelina inclined her head, though the words rested more in the air than between them. By midday, they returned to the hollow. The warmth remained constant there, held within the earth in a way that didn't fade. The small stores grew steadily, neatly arranged, each piece placed with care, nothing left out of order. Thumbelina took her place among them. She worked quietly, adjusting what had shifted, placing each thing where it belonged. The rhythm was simple, and in its simplicity, it settled. Nothing demanded more than what was before her. Nothing asked her to move beyond the space she occupied. And so, the days continued. It was some time before the other came. There had been mention of him, spoken without emphasis, as though he belonged to the same quiet pattern as the rest. But when he arrived, the air changed. Not in warmth, not in sound, but in a kind of presence that moved ahead of him, subtle but certain. The field mouse paused in its work. "He comes," it said. From the deeper passage, the one that didn't lead toward the light, there came a faint disturbance. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, as though something moved with purpose beneath the ground itself. Then he appeared. The mole was larger than the mouse, his form heavier, his movement slower but deliberate. His fur was dark and close, his eyes small and nearly hidden, as though the world of light held little use for him. He entered without hesitation. "Good," he said. "You have kept things in order?" The mouse inclined its head. "It is as it should be." The mole's attention moved slowly through the room, over the stores, the arrangement, the careful balance of what had been gathered. At last, it settled on Thumbelina. "This is the one you spoke of." "She is," said the mouse. "She works." The mole stepped closer. "You will find it well here," he said. "It is warm. It is secure. There's no need to look beyond it." Thumbelina lowered her gaze slightly. "I have found it so." The mole gave a small nod. "Yes." There was little more to say, and after a short while he withdrew again into a deeper passage, leaving behind only the weight of his presence, which lingered even after the air had settled. The days continued. The work remained the same, but something had shifted. The mention of the deeper place, the certainty of it, the quiet completeness the mole had spoken of, it remained in the background of each passing hour. It wasn't troubling, but it didn't fade. One morning, as the air above grew thinner with the turning season, the mouse paused near the entrance. "You will come," it said. "There is a passage to be seen." Thumbelina followed. The path led not toward the light, but alongside it, just beneath the surface, where the roots grew thicker and the earth held a different type of stillness. The mouse moved steadily. "It is well known what lies beneath," it said. "One does not remain always near the surface." The passage narrowed, then widened again, its shape changing with the ground above it. Now and then, a thread of pale light filtered through, but it was faint, easily lost. After a time, the mouse slowed. "There," it said quietly. Thumbelina looked ahead. Something lay across the path. At first, it seemed only a shape, dark against the lighter earth, still and unmoving. But as she stepped closer, the form resolved itself. A bird. Its wings were folded tightly against its body, its feathers pressed close, as though it had drawn itself inward against the cold. Its head rested low, its beak turned slightly toward the ground. It didn't move. The air around it was cooler. The space held a stillness that was not the same as the rest. Thumbelina paused. The mouse didn't approach. "It is no matter," it said. "It has come to its end. Such things happen when the weather turns." It moved as though to pass by. But Thumbelina remained where she was. Her gaze rested on the bird. There was no sound from it, no visible breath. And yet, something in its form, something not yet fully settled, held her there. "We will go on," the mouse said. Thumbelina didn't answer at once. Then she stepped forward. Not away, but closer. The passage grew quiet again once the mouse had moved on. Its steps faded into the soft distance of the tunnel, leaving Thumbelina alone beside the still form of the bird. The air held its usual coolness, though now there was a faint softness within it, as though the season above had begun to turn. She knelt. For a moment, she didn't touch it. She only looked at the close-folded wings, the fine layering of feathers, the way its shape held itself as though waiting. Then she placed her hands gently on its side. It was cold, but not without something beneath it. She gathered what she could find, dry grasses, loosened strands of root, anything that might hold warmth rather than lose it. She arranged them carefully around the bird, shaping a small shelter that didn't press, but protected. Then she remained. The days passed in a quiet rhythm. Thumbelina kept her work in the mouse's home. She gathered, sorted, and arranged as she had been shown, but moving within the order that had been set. But she always returned. Each day, she came back to the passage. She brought small things with her, what warmth she could carry, what softness she could find. She settled beside the bird and placed her hands against it, offering what little heat she held. She didn't speak much. There was no need. The bird didn't answer, but it didn't leave. The air began to change. The cold loosened its hold, slowly, without announcement. The faint light that reached the passage grew steadier, carrying with it a gentler warmth. Then one day, beneath her hands, there was movement. It was slight, a small shift, almost lost. But it came again. A breath. Thumbelina leaned closer, her hands steady, her presence unchanged. The bird's eyes opened. "You've stayed," it said softly. "I have," she answered. It rested for a moment, then spoke again. You have kept me through the cold. It was needed. The words settled simply between them. The days that followed were different. The bird grew stronger. Its wings stirred, then stretched. Its voice steadied. It spoke sometimes of the sky, of the open air, of distance, of light that didn't fade into the earth. Thumbelina listened. She didn't speak of the hollow. But it remained. The mouse had begun to prepare. You will be settled soon, it said one day as they arranged the stores. It is well to have things in place before the ground is firm again. Thumbelina's hand slowed. He will come, the mouse added. It is fitting. I understand, she said, but the words did not come to rest within her. When the mole returned, he spoke as he always had, quietly, with a certainty that didn't shift. It is a good place, he said. It does not change, and it holds what is needed. The mouse agreed. Thumbelina stood nearby. After a time, the mole turned to her. You will remain here, he said. There's no better way. The words did not press, but they closed the space around them. Yes, she said. And yet, something within her remained open. That evening, she returned to the passage. The bird was fully awake now. The air around it no longer held the stillness of winter. It moved gently, carrying with it the sense of something returning. It is time, the bird said. Thumbelina sat beside it. Yes? You are not made for the earth below, it said. You stayed where there is no sky. There is care here, she said. There is order. The bird shifted its wings. And is there light? She didn't answer, but she lifted her gaze toward the faint brightness above. The next day, the warmth reached the passage fully. The bird stood, its wings open, steady and sure. You may come with me, it said. I will carry you where the air is wide. Thumbelina remained silent for a moment. Behind her lay the hollow, the warmth, the order, the quiet expectation of life that would not change. Ahead, there was something she had not yet seen. Then she rose. She stepped forward, and she climbed gently onto the bird's back. They moved upward. The passage widened. The air shifted. And then they rose into the open world. The sky stretched above them, pale and clear. The air moved freely, lifting and settling without weight. The earth below opened outward, fields, water, flowers, each part resting within the whole without closing it. Thumbelina rested lightly against the bird's feathers. She didn't cling. She simply remained. They flew across wide spaces, beyond the marsh, beyond the fields, to a place where the light rested differently. Finally, the bird descended into a garden, and it was filled with flowers, but not as she had known them before. These did not tower above her. They opened at her height. Their petals curved outward in shapes that seemed to be made to hold, not to overwhelm. Their colors were soft, but full, their forms balanced, as though each one belonged exactly where it had grown. The bird came to rest among them. You may remain here, it said. Thumbelina stepped down. The ground beneath her was warm. The air moved gently. And around her, others. They moved among the flowers, small as she was, not hidden, not out of place, simply present. And one came forward. He was no larger than she was. His wings rested lightly at his back, and a small crown lay upon his head. delicate as the petals around them. "You have come far," he said. "I have," she answered. "This is our home," he said. "We live among the flowers, we tend them, and they hold us in return." He paused, then added, "You may stay, if that is what you choose." Thumbelina looked all around. Nothing pressed, nothing expected. The space remained open. "It is what I choose," she said. He inclined his head. Then after a moment, he lifted his hand to the crown he wore. He removed it slowly, not as something to give away, but as something that no longer needed to stand apart. He held it between them. "You are as I am," he said. The words were simple, not offered, only recognized. Thumbelina reached forward. She took the crown in her own hands. It was light. She held it for a moment, then placed it gently upon her own head. It rested there easily, as though it had always belonged. He smiled, not with surprise, but with understanding. "You will have a place here," he said, "not given, but shared." He extended his hand, and she took it. The bird rose once more, lifting into the open air. Thumbelina watched as it circled above, then turned and flew on. Then she turned back. The flowers moved softly around her. The others passed nearby, their lives unfolding without interruption. Then she stepped forward, not carried, not placed, but choosing where to stand. And at last, she belonged. Now, the garden stands quiet. The petals have settled into their gentle rest. The stems hold the warmth of the day. The small paths between the flowers remain just as they were, open, calm, and undisturbed. And above, the sky stretches softly into the night, wide and untroubled. What once wandered has come to stillness. What once searched has found its place, and the world in its quiet way has come back into balance. Somewhere beyond the garden, the air moves lightly through the open fields, unchanged, unhurried, as though it always has known how things would settle in the end. And here, among the flowers, something steady remains, not placed in haste, but shaped with time, with care, and with quiet understanding. So now, you may rest too. Let the garden go still around you. Let the light soften and gently fade. Let the open sky drift beyond your thoughts, and let sleep come easily, without effort. There is nothing more to follow, nothing more to decide. Only stillness now, only warmth, only rest. Sleep now. You are safe, and you are loved. You have been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.